Floppy drives and floppy disks are a thing of the past in this modern world. But when you're working on retro machines, you need to make sure that your stuff is clean, because this is what kills floppy disks. Welcome to Hardware Asylum. In this episode, we're going to be working again on the Primo case build. It's been a while since we've revisited this case, and since then we've worked on several other projects, including the Supra Pi modem and the subwoofer. We're working on the final build for that right now, and for us to do any sound tests with that subwoofer, we need to put together a nice Retro PC. Unfortunately, I had a few issues with the scam case, and for more information on that, be sure to check out the June episode of the Hardware Asylum Podcast Extra. I'll put a link to that down in the show notes below. Unfortunately, when projects sit around, they tend to collect a lot of dust. We had to do a little bit of cleanup before we can start putting this machine together. Fortunately, the inside of this case is still clean. The motherboard that we're going to be putting in the Primo case build is going to be Pentium 2. And Pentium 2 is near and dear to my heart, partially because this is when I started to really pay attention to computer hardware, and it's also when I transitioned from the baby AT form factor to an ATX. The nice thing about Pentium 2 is that you still have that single core performance. It is still a DOS-based machine, although it is powerful enough to run Windows XP. It is also a platform that introduced the AGP slot, and it was really a stopgap between the Pentium Pro, which was really super expensive, and a more retail-friendly version of that same platform. We have 4 motherboards here. We tested all of these before recording with the intention of finding the best match. Processor compatibility, what kind of overclocking features they had, and then the basic performance. For detailed charts on testing of these motherboards, be sure to check out the article on hardwareasylum.com. There will be a link down in the show notes below. So I'm going to go quickly through these 4 motherboards, show you what we're dealing with. The first board is a PC chip. We're going to call it the PC100BX Pro. It has a SYS chipset, onboard AGP graphics, 3 memory slots, terrible performance, terrible processor compatibility. This particular board would be great in an office environment where you need to have everything on the board because it is all self-contained. It's relatively inexpensive and great for just everyday use. The next board that I looked at was the FIC KA6100. This motherboard is also utter garbage. It's one I picked up off of a Google search of all things from a recycler in the Midwest somewhere. The reason I picked up this board is because it was relatively complete. It came with the brackets to hold the CPU in place. It came with all of the accessories. But what I determined is once I started testing this motherboard that the first generation VIA chipset has terrible AGP compatibility, performance is terrible, and it was not very well supported by FIC, likely because the chipset was bad. So we have poor processor compatibility, we have poor AGP compatibility, and those sorts of things are really important when you're running Windows 95, Windows 98. The next board is over here. This is another VIA-based. This one is using the upgraded chipset of the one that was on the FIC board. This one's from A-Trend. Motherboard is very green, and this is model number ATC 6310V-01. This particular motherboard is awesome. Supports processors with front-side bus of 66, 100 and 133. Memory support matches with overclocking support all the way to 150. Has an excellent AGP slot, and it also comes with an upgraded IDE controller. What I like about this motherboard is it supports every processor that I have in my collection that I was going to use in the Primo case, except for Coppermine. On the downside, this motherboard had really poor memory performance, despite supporting memory modules up to 133 megahertz. Now the final motherboard is right here, and this is the one that we're going to be putting into the Primo case build. This is also an A-Trend motherboard, and the major difference here is that we have the famed Intel BX400 chipset. The layouts between the two motherboards are virtually identical. In terms of performance, it had excellent memory support, I already mentioned that it supported all the processors that I had. The only downside is that when you're running 133 megahertz processors, it overclocks the AGP and PCI bus. While that does give you a little bit better performance, speaking from the overclocking side of things, of course when you're putting together a machine with retro hardware like this, you have to deal with what is available. We have BIOS support that is limited because those companies in some cases are no longer available, and also the available hardware that's in the market. And while this motherboard supports everything that I have in my collection, we're going to be downgrading slightly so that we have the best compatibility and the best stability. One thing I hate about buying computer components secondhand is that they will oftentimes be coming out of a recycling center. And in doing so, we have the whim of the recycler who has to remove everything that they think is of value off of the board. So in some cases we won't get a battery, some cases we won't get a CMOS chip, and in the case of Pentium 2 machines, we don't get the mounting hardware. For some stupid reason, they decide that, oh, well, let's remove everything plastic on the board. So as you can see, we have some holes here. There are supposed to be some posts and brackets in the back that will hold these brackets in place. When I bought this motherboard, it was completely bare. I had to buy these new off of eBay. I picked up another retention bracket off of eBay, and all of those were just leftover parts because the recyclers threw away all the plastic bits. Fortunately, I have a 3D printer, so I was able to replace some of these brackets down the bottom. We're going to install them now. So the purpose of these brackets in the back that are missing is to provide a bit of lateral support and insulation to the screws that are mounted in the back here so that we can install the posts. It is possible to use a screw like this with an appropriate washer, install it on the back of the board like that, and you'll be able to install this bracket, assuming that you have that bracket. I wanted to give my motherboard the factory appearance, so I 3D printed some parts like this. And once you install the screws, like so, they drop into place. And we'll wrap around the slot pins, just like if it was a factory part. Now, one of the reasons I vented about these plastic bits being gone and having to buy these little brackets on eBay is that eventually you'll not be able to source these components at all, making the Pentium 2 one of those retro machines that will eventually not be able to be used. These brackets are also not a required component to run a Pentium 2 or Pentium 3 in the slot configuration. All they do is they orient the processor so it doesn't flop around. It's very similar to installing a PCI or AGP card using the expansion slots in the chassis to hold them in place. It makes it much more secure. For this particular build, I wanted to make sure that this machine looked and felt as factory as possible, and also give me the ability to move it around, take it to shows, and use it as a proper retro machine. So now that those brackets are installed, we can install the processor. The way this works is these little tabs on the side here, they lock in place here. Once I slide it into the slot, you should hear a couple of clicks. That means it is installed. Alright, the Pentium 3 Primo build has now been completed. On the front we have a standard LG CD-ROM, Below that we have one of my 5¼ inch TAC drives, and below that is just a generic TAC 3.5. Of course, down at the bottom we have the Hardware Asylum case badge, looking good. Inside the build, we have the Pentium 3 500. We saw that before. We maxed out the memory at 768 megabytes. The first video card is an ATI Rage Pro. Below that we have a Canopius Pure 3D 2 Voodoo card, Voodoo 2 actually. Below that's network card, and then we have the AW64 from the Scam Case build. And I think I'm going to wrap up the video right here. So if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below or contact us at hardwareasylum.com. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing. We'll see you in the next one.